Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor here at Rice University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Arthur Spirling of New York University. His talk is entitled Text Preprocessing for Unsupervised Learning. This is a joint work with Matthew Denny of Penn State. Arthur's talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And all of the questions will generally be answered at the end of the talk, unless it's something very clarifying, in which case I'll pipe up to relay the question to Arthur. A link to Arthur's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. And I will post that link to the slides right after Arthur gets started. And now I'd like to welcome Arthur Spirling to the IMC. Arthur, welcome.
Thank you very much, Justin. So today I'm going to be presenting some work with Matthew Denny. Matthew Denny is finishing his PhD at Penn State. And we're interested in text preprocessing. So that is how we think about making our texts into data. And in particular, what it means for how we do unsupervised learning. And I'm going to talk about two types of unsupervised learning today, although hopefully what we're saying applies to all such cases. Okay, so as I said, it's why it matters, when it can mislead potentially, and then what we think you should do about that. And mostly that's to say you should think carefully about theory and think carefully about what effects what you're doing might be having. And we'll also talk about some software that we have. So just to give everybody an overview about how text as data research typically takes place, you know, we have all these fantastic people working in this literature right now. We have some research design, you know, we're interested in, say, how Japanese politicians appeal to constituents or something like this. And we go out and get some really impressive data. Maybe we get some manifestos, you know, and we have to transcribe them and do all sorts of things to them. And then we do something, a point we'll come back to in a minute. And then we do some analysis. So for example, here that might be some kind of topic model, a simple one, or a more complicated one has become, you know, popular recently. And then we publish those results, and presumably we do very well out of that literature. Okay, so I like this type of work for reasons of numerical harmony. Particularly, I like this type of work, but I want to focus on a very specific part of this sequence of science, if you will. And the part that me and Matt want to focus your attention on are these three question marks here. So how we go from data collection, that is to say, we've gathered all this amazing data, to what we put into the model. And it's that process of thinking about how we alter our data to make it modelable in some regards that we're going to focus on today, and specifically in the unsupervised context. So here is just to get everybody on the same page. I'm sure folks who are watching are probably familiar with this idea. But what we're going to do is convert text to numbers. And this is a completely general operation, and we do it in many, many circumstances. So here's Roosevelt, and he's making a statement about something, and he's using these different terms, right? And in some sense, we want to convert that into something that we might call a document feature matrix, or alternatively, we might transpose that, but the idea is the same. And you know, each row is a document, and each column is telling us the incidence, in this case, it's a count of some particular word that he used. Now, what you'll notice straight away, and this is a point we'll return to in a minute, is that the words that we see as columns, right, are not necessarily the words that appear in the document. And that's because we've done some kind of pre-processing, which I'll talk about in a second, to perhaps make our lives easier, to perhaps make sure that certain words are joined together in a way that makes sense. So for example, induction has become induct. He talks about the presidency, but actually that's become lowercase, then we're talking about presid, right? And there's some shortening of that term. And of course, we can imagine that these columns go on for a long time, and we're filling out the numbers in each case. Okay, so something clearly has gone on, and you know, that's typically how we would handle a document like this. So what sorts of things do we do? So what is preprocessing? So preprocessing, from our perspective, is some way that we handle the data before modeling it, right? And here are some really common ways to do that preprocessing. So we might remove punctuation. We might say that, look, We don't really think it matters whether you use a period or an exclamation point. Indeed, we don't really think that matters at all, so we're going to remove that. We might remove numbers, right? We might think that for our particular application, numbers aren't very important. We might lowercase everything. We don't really care whether you're using it as a proper noun, or perhaps more particularly, we don't care whether you're using it at the start of a sentence or not, right? Doesn't really matter. We might stem. So stemming is this term, again, I know many folks will be familiar with it, but if you're not, it means essentially taking words back to their root. So for example, jumping and jumped, well, we think that's conceptually similar, so we might make that into just one word, jump. We might remove stop words, and here we're thinking about, in English anyway, we're thinking about sort of function words, which we don't think connotes a sort of specific meaning, so by, of, the, so on. We might remove some really infrequent terms, so there are different thresholds for these things. We might remove, say, words that occur in less than some percentage of documents, or are very rare in some regards. And then finally, if we had lots of kind of computational room, I'll talk about this in a second, we might include, say, bigrams and trigrams. So for those that don't know, right, typically these models are working on unigrams, which are these one-word sort of token-level things. We're just counting up, was this word, how many times was this word used? But we might think about bigrams. So that's 2 words together or 3 words together, and so on, right? Perhaps that captures some notion of important ordering in a document or something like that. So straight off the bat, you'll see that there are sort of 7 binary choices here, right? Now, in practice, of course, sometimes it's continuous, and so we might think of these things as being, we do more of one or less of one. But let's just suppose, as is typically the case in all the applications that me and Matt see, right, that you're making binary choices. You're doing this thing or you're not. So 7 binary choices means that if we include the raw document at the start, i.e. where we didn't make any of these choices, we did none of them, right? We have something like 128 different specifications, so 2 to the 7. Because we can remove punctuation and then not do the rest, we can remove punctuation and remove numbers and then not do the rest, so on and so forth. So clearly there's lots and lots of options for how we pre-process our document, which is to say there's lots of options in terms of how we produce this document frequency matrix, right? And that presumably might affect the results that we get. So let's think about this from the perspective of both supervised and unsupervised learning. So does it matter, right? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's lots of options, but it doesn't really matter what we do. Well, in the case of supervised learning, that's probably true. It doesn't really matter what we do. Or actually, that's imprecise. It certainly does matter what we do, but we can be really precise about how it's affecting things. And if you look at this literature in computer science, it's very large, right? So people will say, if you're studying movie reviews, then you want to remove these types of items, leave these other ones in, and this will get you a better, say, accuracy at the end of the day. It will give you a larger area under the curve. So with respect to some very objective criteria that maybe we agree on, right, this will change that, but we can give each other advice about that because we all agree that that's what we're trying to maximize or minimize or whatever it might be. So we think things are less clear in unsupervised learning. So if you think about, and these are these kind of prototypical diagrams from work by Bly et al. And thinking of Subtopic Models, but it's very general actually. We would argue that there's not really a general performance measure, right? So one of the beauties, indeed one of the strengths of unsupervised learning is it sort of helps us to organize the data collection, and then it helps us sort of discover what we've seen or describe what are in those documents, which may have been unclear to us. So in some sense, that structure was latent, we couldn't observe it directly, we ran some unsupervised method, and then we get to observe that, and we think that's great. But the problem with it is that it's not really clear what the performance measure is. It's hard, very hard, to give an objective measure of how much we've discovered and whether what we've discovered is kind of correct or not, right? This is very difficult. So a consequence for us is when we think about how pre-processing affects things, we tend to think that, yes, it probably does affect the conclusions that we draw. And now I'm going to move on to think about how it might affect those conclusions. So one of the things that you might be thinking is that perhaps there is enough sort of evidence from the field, since all these great people have been working in this area, that we can just do certain steps and they'll work perfectly for us. The thing is, it's not clear just from looking at well-cited papers in this area exactly what steps we should follow. So some, like this is this great and very important paper from Stipin and Proch, they're looking at wordfish, which we'll look at in a minute, right? They have a particular sequence of things that they want to do. So they want to remove punctuation, they want to remove, they want to stem, they want to lowercase, so on and so forth. And this isn't true of something like Bremer and King, for example, in the 2011 piece, right? So again, it's not clear, what advice we should follow. Maybe we should sort of follow all of the advice, but then there's also these issues of research degrees of freedom where you're kind of just picking the specification that gives you the answer that you want. And as I said, that's an issue in unsupervised learning precisely because it's hard to have an objective measure of what's been discovered and what hasn't. So what could possibly go wrong? So we're going to show you, in some sense, these are existence results about things that could happen that would lead you to be nervous about sort of arbitrary pre-processing steps. So to motivate this, I'm going to use a very simple example from Manifesto Corpus. So many people watching will know that Manifesto is an incredibly popular thing to study, especially in the European context. Released every year, the party writes down, purportedly what it's going to do. And we're going to look specifically at the UK. So the actual UK Manifesto Corpus we have is till 2001, from 1918 to 2001. And we have the 3 parties, but we're going to look at just 2 parties. We're going to look at Wordfish, which is a sort of possum-based unsupervised learning algorithm for thinking about or for fitting models where you care about how parties are distributed on a given, typically single dimension. And we're going to pre-process the document term matrix 128 ways, or rather, we're going to have the original one, which is raw, which hasn't been pre-processed, and then we're going to pre-process it 128 different ways, and we're going to see whether the rank order that results, specifically we're going to look at just 8 manifestos to keep things simple, we're going to see if that's robust, okay? And obviously we hope that it is in some sense, right? So we hope that it doesn't really matter how we pre-process our documents, our results or our conclusions substantively are basically the same. So just to fix ideas, this doesn't matter whether you agree with this or not, actually, it just helps to clarify how people think about this stuff in the field. We're going to think of the Conservatives in 1983 as being a fairly right-wing manifesto, and we're going to think of Labour in 1983 as being a fairly left-wing. So like I say, we're just looking at a few manifestos between Labour and Conservative, the 2 main parties in the UK at this time, and just for a few years in the 80s and 90s. This keeps it under control in terms of how to interpret the results. So here are the different rankings that Wordfish produces. So let me explain what's going on here. So in each row, we have a different way of pre-processing the documents. Okay, so for example, that could mean that you did punctuation stopping, but you didn't do anything else, right? And that would be one of the specifications. So this plot has 128 rows. And reading from left to right, if what we got out accords with our priors, and you can disagree with our priors, that doesn't matter for the example, but if it accords with our priors, right, then it's going to go from a deep red or deep pink to a kind of dark blue. Okay? So clearly there are some which accord with our priors, these ones at the top in here, right? That's kind of what we thought would happen. But there are other cases where it's not what we thought in terms of our prior beliefs about these manifestos. So for example, down here, we see some misplaced manifestos. So for example, here in these dark red areas in the middle of the table, it seems that Labour 1987 manifesto is being placed as the most left-wing, right? And in some sense, we think that's not correct. We think 1983 is the most left-wing. And similarly with the Conservatives. So we see, for example, that for some specifications in here, Conservative 1983 manifesto is typically being placed as a sort of much less right-wing place, or even down here, it's very mild relative to the other Conservative manifestos. So to sort of summarize that, right, we have 12 unique document rankings, each of which is legitimate, given that we don't have any particular theory for pre-processing. But the problem is that we have substantially different conclusions. And just to give you a sense of this, and you can look at this in your own time, but you'll see that if we wanted to, we could have a specification where we find that Labour 1987 is the most left, and there's also a specification where Labour 1992 is the most left, and one where Labour 1983 is the most left, and similarly for the Conservatives, depending on what we choose. So this slide is entitled Forking Paths because it's deliberately a reference to work done by Andrew Gelman with co-authors, various co-authors, where he talks about this idea of, it's not malfeasance on behalf of researchers, it's this idea that they take a decision at the start and this leads them to further conclusions down the line. And in this case, it's a coding decision they're taking. So you can think of pre-processing as a decision about how you code things, right? How do you code this word? How do you code this document? How do you think about the vector that represents this document? And forking paths can lead you to different substantive conclusions. So maybe it's just true of scaling models. Maybe it's not true of topic models, which are phenomenally popular in political science and computer science. So we had a quick look at some topic models. So here we're looking at, these are some statements from some senators. This is this well-known paper, very highly regarded paper by Grimmer in 2010. And he sent us the documents, and we're just going to take a sample of these documents, mostly for computational reasons. It's not going to affect the general conclusions we draw. So we have a sample of 1,000 documents, so it's 10 senators, each with 100 documents. We're not going to look at the n-grams. So the idea is we're going to fit a whole bunch of topic models, but when you add in n-grams, it makes the space very large. It takes us a long time to compute that. And we're going to find the optimal numbers of topics for each specification. So we're going to work through all the different ways that we could pre-process this data, and we're going to ask, what does the machine think is the optimal number of topics? We're going to use a measure called perplexity. You may disagree with that measure, and sometimes I think we disagree with that measure too, but it is a measure that people use, right? So it's a way that people think about whether this topic model is optimal or not. And we're just simply going to show that we get different results. Okay. And we're going to use LDA for those who are interested, but it would almost certainly have very similar conclusions whether we used latent Dirichlet allocation or some other model. So what are we looking at here? So on the x-axis, we're doing different numbers of pre-processing steps. And on the y-axis, we've got the optimal number of topics, okay? And in the paper, we move through different numbers of topics in each case, and we try to work out which, by this perplexity measure, is optimal. So there isn't really a pattern overall. It's more to sort of show you the type of variance that you can get. So for example, if we do lots of pre-processing steps, like this is, we're doing everything here, including removing the infrequent words. Remember I said we're not going to do the n-grams in this particular case. And then it thinks the optimal number of topics is around 75, okay? But what if I did just, I don't know, removing, doing some removal of stop words, then it thinks the optimal number of topics is around 200. And you can see the variance here in terms of different results that we could get, where results means what does this purportedly objective measure of quality think the optimal model is. Okay. So in that sense, it could lead us astray. It could take us off to a different part of the modeling space. What about substance? In the paper, we go into more detail about this, and I'll just give a very brief overview here of what we're trying to do. So what we show in the paper is that if you think about interpreting a topic as being, looking at its top terms, right? So sometimes when we generate a topic model, we say, what was this topic about? Well, here's its top terms. And here we're looking at some possible top terms for different specifications. And remember, a specification here is just, what did you do to the data before you fit the topic model? Okay, so these are specifications running down the sides here. So just for simplicity, we put them side by side, but you can think of this whole table as being under this one. And the key thing that we want to note is that the nature of those top terms varies, okay, depending on how you specify the data, so how you pre-process the data. So in particular, there are some specifications, for example, this one up here, PNLSWI, where terrorism, is forming 1% to 2% of all the topic top terms, right? But there are other specifications where terrorism just doesn't emerge as a top term. Okay. So in that sense, if you were doing this particular way of thinking about topics, about what is important to senators and what isn't, some of these things turn up and some of them don't. All right. So in that sense, your substantive conclusions presumably are different. Okay. So just to conclude this kind of first part of the talk, different pre-processing steps yield different technical, but here we mean perplexity, and substantive conclusions. And this seems very worrying, right? So it seems a concern because it means that we might not be able to reproduce what somebody else did. We might have completely different conclusions because we happen to pick a different pre-processing technique. So a solution to this, I don't want to overstate this term solution, but it's an idea that we have, is Pretext, which is a piece of software and also a technique. So it's going to tell us about the consequences of what we're doing in terms of preprocessing. We're going to, in a second, characterize a set of corpora where we're going to look at some political documents. And we have an easy-to-use R package, and if you don't like it, you can break it open and take a look, and you can write an issue to Matthew Denny, who's my colleague on GitHub. I'm sure he'll enjoy dealing with problems that you find in the software. Okay, so you can download this today. It's on CRAN. We're just updating it a little bit recently, actually, to make it commensurate with Quantida, which is Benoit et al. Their package. It works using Quantida's particular preprocessing steps, but it's available as of today. So what's the fundamental idea behind pretext as a technique? So we're going to think about the raw case, right, where there's no preprocessing. So you just gather your documents, you take the counts, and that's your base case. And we're going to think about how distances, in particular pairwise distances between documents, change as we do different things to the data. Okay, where different things means you do or you do not do certain preprocessing steps. And we're going to provide a measure of how unusual those changes are. And the more unusual those changes are, that is to say, the more different this specification seems to be relative to other ones you could have picked, right? Perhaps we're going to advise you to be more cautious. So here's a toy example. We've got some documents, just 3 documents in this collection perhaps, or this is a set of 3 from a broader collection. And we've got some measurement of distance between them. So document 1 to 2 is 1, document 2 to 3 is 2, document 1 to 3 is 3. So there is some distance between these documents. So we can think about one specification as just doubling all distances. And in some sense, this isn't a very interesting specification, or at least it's not really doing anything, right? So if in our original example, we conclude that the person in document 1 is far apart from the person in document 3, we'd presumably conclude the same thing here. Document 1 and 3 are still pretty far apart. In fact, they're the most far apart relative to the other documents. All we've done is multiply by a constant. But let's think about specification number 2, right here at the bottom, where things are a bit different now. So previously, we thought 1 and 3 were kind of the furthest apart, but now we think 2 and 3 are far apart. Okay, and we've also kind of jumbled some of the other ranks. So in fact, we can sort of codify that. So here what we're doing on this left-hand side, we're looking at the original, we're saying, what was the distance between 1 and 3, distance between 2 and 3, distance between 1 and 2, and so on. And these are just, I'm reading off from this original specification. In specification 2, I'm doing the same thing. D here is just a distance. We're saying, what was the distance between document 2 and document 3, document 1 and 2, 1 and 3, and so on. And as we can see, they've changed. So how should we measure those changes, right? And again, if you want to think about the change, think about it as, if you want to think about the measure, think about it as cosine distance, Euclidean distance, just something that we can measure. We're going to measure it as an absolute rank difference change. So here, what's happening? Well, we're saying that the change in the distance for document 1 and 3 was that it went from the highest to being the lowest down here. So it went through a rank change of 2. It moved down 2 ranks. What about documents 2 and 3? Well, that started out having a distance of 2, and it was in the middle of the pack, right? It was the second distance. And it moved up 1 to 6, so the top here. So that has a rank difference change of 1. And actually the same is true of documents 1 and 2. And we're going to use that information. So to see how we're going to use that information, let's just start with some first specification. We'll call it M1. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just some specification that you're doing. So every specification, right, that you do, of the 127 you could do, other than the raw case, right, will have a pair that moves most. That makes sense, right? So doing some pre-processing moves pairs around, right? And just as some intuition here, right, is that, perhaps they have a stop word in common. And if I remove those stop words, they don't have that in common anymore, so presumably they're going to move further apart. But you can imagine that being true of all these different binary things that we could do. So we're going to think about the pair that moves most, and we'll call that the largest mover. And we're going to ask the following question. So what is the rank of that largest mover in terms of the distances induced by every other specification? Okay. So I think this is easier actually if I just explain it with a simple vector, right? So there is some largest mover when I do my specification relative to the base case. Some pair of documents moves the most, right? And then I'm going to ask, where was that pair in terms of how much it moved in every other specification, in all the other 127 specifications, or 126 now, excuse me, because we've already done one. Well, here it looks like that in the second specification, right, M2, okay, the rank of that largest moving pair has now gone down to 2. In the third specification, maybe this is something else, like maybe we're adding stemming or something, it's gone down to 14. It's 2 in M4, which is the 4, and so on and so on and so forth. So what does this tell us? Well, one way to think about this is that if we take the average of that, right, so we take the difference of that vector from 1, right, it tells us in some sense how unusual our specification was. Okay? So let's think about an extreme case in which this is all 1s, so this vector is all 1s. So that would mean that our particular specification that we chose, the largest mover that we said was the largest mover, was also the largest mover in every other specification that we could have done. Okay? So in some sense, we sort of feel safe in that context. And of course, we could do that for every specification that exists. Now, of course, you know, we don't care just about the largest mover in terms of pairwise distance. In the paper, we generalize this, and we allow you to think about the kind of k largest moving document pairs. And we do some housekeeping to make sure it all adds up. I'll get into intuition in a moment, but then we come up with a pretext score. So a pretext score is the score on a specification. It's telling you in some sense, how unusual is this specification relative to every other specification you could have done in terms of how it makes documents move, or actually more specifically, in terms of how it moves pairs of documents. So this score will be between 0 and 1, and that's because of some housekeeping we do to ensure that it's normalized like that. And a lower score tells us that this specification, and again, every time I say specification, I just mean this series of steps that I took, right, results in what we call typical changes in document distances. So a pair that was ranked as a, you know, k top mover in some specification was generally ranked around there when you did some other specification. So if you think about it as this pair of documents, you know, this pair of these speeches from this senator and this senator, right, that moved as much approximately in this specification as it did in every other specification. A higher score, however, tells you that it's somewhat atypical, right? So the pairwise changes that we were able to induce, or we did induce with this particular specification that we chose, those aren't usual, right? They're not replicated elsewhere if we did different pre-processing techniques or different pre-processing steps. Okay, so just to give you a sense of this, I'm not going to dwell on this part too much, but just to show you the variance here. So here we're looking at those press releases, and we're just showing kind of the variance in the pretext score. So each of the rows here is a different pre-processing specification, and we can see, you know, clearly some are more unusual than others, right? So there's some specification right down here at the bottom, which is unusual relative to the others, right? So it is moving these pairwise distances around in a way that's just not typical of everything else you could have done. And others, of course, are very similar that result in big movements. So to get more of a sense of how these different specifications, how these different cases affect a specification score, we did a simple regression, right? So all we're doing here is we're saying, let's calculate for a given specification what the pretext score was, and then regress it on all the things we did or didn't do, right? So punctuation is either binary, it's either you remove punctuation or you didn't, or other the other way around. You either didn't remove punctuation or you did. You either chose to not remove numbers or you did, so on and so forth. Okay. So what's the results? Well, here are some corpora that we sort of worked with, and we've picked them because they're, you know, we think they're similar to things that people are using in political science. So just to talk you through a plot here, so this is going back to these UK manifestos. And so what do we see, right? So we see that removing stop words, for example, so this is the third row on the first top left plot, right, results in a kind of decline on average in those pretext scores. So what does that mean? It means that imagine you had a pre-processing specification, and at the margin you're trying to decide, should I remove stop words or not? So if you make the step of removing stop words, you're making your specification look more like other specifications in terms of how the pairwise distances change. By contrast, we've got the State of the Union speeches here. This is a very well-known corpus, you know, going back to the 1800s, right? And we're looking at what removing stop words does. Well, removing stop words here tends to result in a situation where you're on average, increasing those pretext scores. So you're in a situation where it's inducing something, you're inducing at the margins a specification which is unusual relative to all the other specifications you could have done. And when it overlaps with 0, it doesn't, at the margin, have an effect either way. So we've got some UK manifestos, State of the Union speeches, we've got some Indian treaties. This is from some work I did a few years ago, some death row statements. So these are very quite depressing statements, short statements of people who are about to be put to death in Texas. They were available on the state government website. What you'll notice is that there are a load of things here which don't make much difference. For example, whether you remove numbers or not doesn't make much of a difference, which makes sense because typically these folks don't really mention numbers at all, so it doesn't, doesn't make a difference whether you include them or not. A bunch of press releases, some New York Times articles, House bills, and some everybody's favorite, some Trump tweets. Okay. The main thing I want to take from this is that basically it depends, right? So it's not the case that always doing some particular step, such in this case, removing stop words, has the same effect. It's also not obvious that it's either desirable or undesirable. So there may be reasons that you actually want to throw things into starker relief, and for example, something unusual might be beneficial, or it might not be. Come back to that in a second. So as I said, different preprocessing steps matter for different corpora, and in fact in different ways. So what should you do about this? Well, one way to think about parameter estimates, the ones I just gave, is that they're something of an early warning, right? They tell you that this was unusual in some sense. So in some regards, doing this preprocessing affected your results in some sense. So what could you do? Well, the most conservative thing is you could just average the results over all the specifications. The alternative actually is to have a better theory, right? We'll talk about that in a second. And part of what we mean by theory is giving a strong reason why you want some particular specification. So what we noted in this literature is that a lot of what goes on is people say, well, I'm going to preprocess my documents in this way because I read another article which was using completely different documents, completely different substantive idea, but I'm just going to copy what they did because it seems safe, right? So we don't think that's a very good theory, but you might have a world in which that makes sense. So maybe you've done hundreds of analyses of these types of documents, and you know that you want numbers out for some reason because it doesn't make sense for the thing that you care about. So we're going to think about 3 cases. You can imagine a situation where none of those parameter estimates are different from 0, right? So we're thinking about things like the death row statements where it doesn't matter if you include numbers or not. It doesn't, and that's great. In that case, everything will be fine. You just go ahead anyway. You might have a strong theory, right, that you should be including or not including certain things, maybe based on previous work that you've done. And here, when you get parameter estimates that are different from 0, you might want to think carefully about robustness, right? So you might want to theorize about why you're doing this preprocessing or not. Is this case that you're referring to really like your case or not? And finally, which unfortunately we think is probably the modal category in political science, is that there's weak theory, and in some sense, this is endogenous. So there's weak theory, which is sort of why people are using unsupervised techniques in the first place. Of course, theory there is being used in 2 slightly different senses. So some parameter estimates are significantly different from 0, maybe all parameter estimates are significantly from 0. And we're joking here, of course, but we do think that you want to think carefully about what you're doing in this case, right? So if it's the case that you're fitting models without theory about how you should be preprocessing, and those preprocessing steps, in some sense, there's evidence that they affect your results ultimately in terms of those pairwise distances, right? You might want to be a bit more conservative and aggregate over the results. So in the paper, we worked through this example, but let's just think about going back to that UK wordfish case. So we have some weak theory, and so we think, well, we're just going to do what everyone else seems to do, which are these steps here, right? Which is, punctuation numbers, lowercasing, stemming, removing stop words, and then removing some infrequent terms. And then we observe the UK manifestos, and we see that we get significant parameter estimates here. So these things don't matter, actually. Whether we use n-grams or not doesn't matter, whether we remove numbers, remove it, so on and so forth. Right? But these things in here do matter, or rather, there is some evidence that they may matter in that they are affecting things at the margins in ways that are not consistent with other ways we could have pre-processed the data. So what we need to do then is sort of average over these 8 specifications. So with stemming and without, with stop words and without, and with punctuation and without, but as a combination. So there are some ways to do that, and we go through those in the paper. Those are not new to the paper, but the particular way that we're suggesting that you do it is new to the paper. And basically you do model averaging, right? So what we're looking at here, over here on the left-hand side is the original sort of placement of these things, where you have, at least purportedly, using that particular choice of specification, you know, conservatives in 1983 are kind of a bit left of conservatives in 1997. That doesn't really accord with our priors. We're a bit worried about that. And then when we do the model averaging, right, so we're averaging over these different 8 combinations, we see things move about a little bit in terms of the point estimates. But perhaps more importantly, we're seeing these bands, right? So these confidence intervals are kind of bloating up a bit, which makes sense, right? So we're saying there are different ways of specifying preprocessing, right? And that should affect where we think something is. So in particular, you know, now if you look at the conservatives in 83, they sort of overlap with the conservatives in 97, because there exists a specification where we can, you know, move them around in some sense, right? And that's important because it makes us more or less, perhaps less sanguine about these stark conclusions about where these parties lie. Again, if you really had strong theory here, maybe it doesn't matter very much, but typically that won't be the case. So to summarize here and to wrap up, right, preprocessing really matters, right? So we think that it does in fact affect technical and substantive performance. And of course, I hope I've showed you that that's the case. And every time that we apply it, we're able to show that it does in fact affect some kind of substantive conclusion. And that makes sense because, you know, ultimately you're changing the way that your data is entering into some model. And we know, of course, the way you code things is very important. Although we think there's little attention paid to this issue. So forking paths of inference, right, again, in that sense, we consider ourselves squarely in that literature of thinking carefully about how you code things. That should come from theory. Often it doesn't because people don't have theory. But if they don't, they've got to think carefully about robustness. Our solution, or one solution, is to think about using pretext. But I would say more generally, even if you don't use that software or you don't like using software, we think people should be clearer about theory. And if they can't be clearer about theory, think about uncertainty and checking robustness, right? So it seems very worrying to us that your conclusions are based on some semi-arbitrary decision about how to pre-process the data. And it would be helpful to show readers that different ways of pre-processing kind of, you know, give you conclusions that are approximately similar. Okay, and we hope that maybe what we've suggested is provide some early learning. So just in terms of software and paper, you can grab it from R, it will work fine. And Matt has a very nice vignette on his GitHub, and you can download the paper there. And just to say thanks to Justin and the sponsors of the colloquium, that's my website, and we welcome any comments or questions. Thank you, Justin.
All right. Thank you, Arthur, for that presentation. At this point, Arthur Spirling is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I was jotting down some questions as you were talking. So the first thing I thought of was, you know, there are lots of similar procedures in regression or in sort of data analysis for averaging over models. And you know, one thing I probably wouldn't tell my students in linear model class to do is, well, if you've got like say 20 possible confounding variables, well, just put in every possible combination of them and then average over the results, and you know that must be the answer.
so this is an interesting thing. So Andrew Gelman has this very nice paper with some co-authors, and I think he's called this research agenda the multiverse, but this particular paper deals with sort of in line with what you're saying. So rather than thinking about whether to include a variable or not, although actually, as you rightly note, that's one way to think about what we're saying, he says, imagine coding everything, every variable you have, every plausible different way, and then looking at the coefficients afterwards on the thing that you care about and seeing sort of how consistent they are across specifications. Now, I mean, that's probably, in most applied work, that's probably overkill. I mean, it's overkill in two senses. I mean, the first is it's just very hard to expect people to do that. I mean, especially observational work, we have a lot of trying to control for a lot of things. That strikes me as, you know, tricky. The other thing, you know, that's hard about it is I think we would prefer people to have theory broadly construed. And it's worth thinking about what theory looks like in this literature. So, you know, theory for text analysis. In the supervised world, it doesn't matter because you can look up what other people have done with a similar problem, and either that works for you or it doesn't in terms of accuracy, and try out different things. I think in this context, we mean theory in the sense of, what have other people done, and what have you done? So one of the interesting sets of comments that we got from, particularly from the CS audience, was they said, oh, look, we spend all day fine-tuning these models. We know what you should have in and what you shouldn't have in. And actually, that's fine. We would certainly encourage that. But we think that's probably not the case in political science in general, where somebody's coming to a new data set, is going to work on it for a couple of years, wants to write up their study. We think it's probably not the case that you have hundreds of hours to work out different specifications.
I mean, one thing I would suggest is in a case where theories is going to be weak, it's at least not weak with respect to the text, but weak with respect to how exactly to process the text. Because I often have theories about what people should say, but
absolutely,
about stop words. One thing you could think about is so like Bayesian model averaging or lasso sort of thing, where what you're doing there is you're shrinking models or eliminating them according to some sort of distance criterion or likelihood. The question is, what's the likelihood in this case? Or what's
I think that's a good point, Justin. I mean, I think so. First, I completely agree that there exist lots of ways to do regularization, but it's hard to think exactly what that would look like. I mean, actually, one of the comments we got, we presented the paper at Paul Meth in an earlier form, and somebody said, well, in some sense, it's not an additive problem, right? So it's kind of interaction. So what you really care about is what happens if you stem and stop at the same time, right? Not just in terms of adding these things up or something like this. Maybe that has an extra effect or something like that. And maybe you want a lasso to kind of take care of that. I think that's a reasonable position. I think that's probably a little bit beyond the current paper, but that's thinking about regularization is important. I mean, again, I would say how popular that type of regularization is in political science, I think is that's not settled in the sense that I think that we still think there should be sort of theory for this stuff, right? So,
yeah. As a general rule, I think you're right. And if we were doing different specifications of like a regression model or something, some people would object to letting the data speak that loudly. But this is more of a pure measurement problem. And in that, I mean, I think people would be more amenable. I mean, I don't know, but I think people would be more amenable. Well, so we have a question from the audience. I want to stop my own.
Okay, sure.
So Daniel Lempert asked, if it's fair to say that there is usually no guidance about what preprocessing to perform, does the lack of robustness to preprocessing choices indicate something fundamentally problematic about certain text analysis methods? And relatedly, in your experience, are there certain text analysis methods that generate results that are more or less robust to preprocessing decisions?
Thanks, Daniel. I think that's a very interesting question. So on the second, let me start with the second part, right? Are there things that, have we looked at certain methods which produce things which are more or less robust? We don't really have a good way to compare those things, and so it would be anecdotal. We would end up saying something like, when we looked at the wordfish results, we were able to get them to move around more or something like than a topic model. So I can't really answer that one directly. I think the first one is a very interesting question, though, and I think it's a very broad and interesting philosophical issue beyond our particular contribution. So this question about should we be skeptical as scientists about certain techniques because the results seem to be fragile. So firstly, I would say that it really depends what you think these techniques should be doing. So if you think that all they should be doing is help us, think about the data, help us discover something in the data or something like that, then maybe it doesn't really matter, right? Your discovery might take you off to go and examine something else, and so that's your problem basically. I think the issue comes when people use particularly unsupervised techniques, particularly topic models, to make a discovery which is then sort of written up as a finding. That bothers me, yes, and that's not even an issue with the fragility to preprocessing, of course, though that's a concern. It's about sort of how we think about what unsupervised techniques are doing, right? There's a lot of information going into that unsupervised technique, and it's hard to know, in some cases, whether that's strictly reproducible or not. I don't mean whether the particular model results are reproducible. They are, subject to this problem of, the different, we might have to do different starts in a topic model because they don't always get the same results. But it's more about what we think the philosophy of using unsupervised models is. I'll finish that by saying what I'm very worried about is the idea of using unsupervised models in a way that's basically supervised. So people have these kind of strong priors about the data. They run an unsupervised model, and then they just kind of write up one set of results. That's all. It's almost a file draw problem, and it worries me. Yes.
We have another question from the audience. I apologize in advance if I pronounce the last name correctly, but Martin Soyland asks, with topic models specifically, the underlying task is to find similarity between usually unique documents. In that sense, stopping or lemmatization or so on makes sense. Should we then be more careful about using pre-processing that fits the application rather than test for all binary choice combinations?
Yes, Martin, I mean, that's completely correct as far as we're concerned. So essentially, if your statement is certain things make sense in certain contexts, and what we mean by make sense is we know something about the underlying statistical model, and that in some sense gives us theory, completely agree. Our concern is about cases where people have very weak theories. So where they're not really sure in their application whether they should do something or not, and they're just kind of following along what someone else has done. If it's the case that we can build up this body of theory where we can show that across all these different substantive areas, doing this particular thing for a topic model makes sense, I think that's great. And I think Matt and I would be very enthusiastic about that, and that would be such a great guide for practitioners. I think at the moment, maybe we're not quite there, and people aren't necessarily sure what to do in a given situation. And that's what we're talking about. But yes, to your main point about, is what we're doing superfluous in the world in which you have a strong grasp of what this is going to do to your data and how you're handling the data? Yes, in some sense, of course. We think you should run it anyway, just to get a sense of how it affects things, maybe to reassure you. But absolutely, we believe in theory, and we believe in theory being the kind of primary factor here.
It's interesting. This is sort of a general or a specific instance of a more general problem, I think, that political scientists and social scientists are struggling with right now, which is how to what to make of all these machine learning inspired techniques that we're starting to be familiar with and use. And in a lot of cases, this is, of course, one of them, but there are others as well. They're not really designed around a theory, right? They're designed to find patterns.
Yes.
Ultimately, I mean, if you get right down to it, what they're designed to do is maximize or minimize some loss criterion or something that's been baked into the system. And, so in the text framework, and so I could sort of conceptualize your project as, well, this is really a measurement model, right? And so this theory may or may not be involved, right?
So let me, right, okay, so this is I have a whole different sort of critique of this stuff, but it's along these lines that you just mentioned. So what does it mean to say that you're using some topic model, right? Mm-hmm. So what's that a model of? Well, it's a model of the data generating process. So that's exactly what it is, and we're going to try and model that and have all these latent variables and sort of thing. Is it a model of human beings and how they produce text? I mean, not really, right? It's not a structural model. We wouldn't say that. We wouldn't say, oh, these topics are, maybe we would say that these topics are kind of reduced form of something that's structural. But it's not really a model in the sense that we use that term, I think, in political science. So I think a literature that's similar here, but has this crucial difference about the structural model is, if you look at, how the modeling of roll calls has evolved. And so we write down a structural model, which is similar maybe to, say, education, except that we have a different interpretation of the parameters and what people are doing and what their utilities are, and they're thinking about the status quo, and so on and so forth. And then we try to have a reduced form model, like a two-parameter logit that corresponds to that structural model, right? In that world, though, we sort of understand the translation from the model of human beings to the model of that we see at the end of the day, this kind of reduced form model. I don't think that's generally the case in these text models. That's not all, I don't want to overdo that, but it's partly because we don't really have a good model of how language is produced. So we don't really have a good sense of why somebody selects this word over this word. We can model it very well in the sense that we can say, let's do some SVM and see whether these Republicans use this word more than these Democrats. Great. But it's not the same really as having an underlying model of human behavior of the parameters of which we're trying to find. And then more generally, thinking about computer science, I think, of course, computer science does great work, and nothing bad to say about that. It's not their problem to fix our concerns about modeling human behavior. Their problem is to do something else, right? So they want to summarize documents or algorithms or whatever. It's our problem to sort of translate that stuff properly and not just use it off the shelf.
Yeah, well, anyway, yeah. So we have one more question. Probably time for one more question from the audience. David Soroki asks, as a practical matter, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what role this form of pre-processing analysis might play in linking text analysis with prior observational studies or experimental studies.
Right. Thanks, David. So I think the essence of David's question, I may be misinterpreting, in which case apologies in advance, is so we observe some experiment, say, where we're asking people to do some free association or something like that, and we have some conclusions, or we ask them to put things in topics or something like that, and we have some conclusions from that, right? And then later, we want to see if that's also true in some observational data. And the question is, I think David's question, I hope I haven't misinterpreted, is how do we use the pre-processing? What does that mean if we use that pre-processing? And I think David's concern is that we can imagine an experiment, people write down things, and they are being very deliberate in how they do it. And then when we go in the observational world, we're saying, oh, let's just exclude this stuff and not worry about it and so on. So I don't have a very good answer for that, actually. I think that it's kind of a bit anodyne or boring to say, obviously, we need to be careful. And we need to think about, when we look at experiments, like why people might have done what we, how they followed the instructions and how they kind of generated these things, right? But our point in general is that you need theory, right? So, and if you don't have theory, you should do what we're doing. But when you take something outside the lab and see if it holds in observational data, right, that's probably a good time to think about how human beings are actually generating the data that we see. And it's probably not appropriate to sort of ignore those experimental results about how that data was generated, and then go off into the real world and sort of use these, as you've mentioned yourself, Justin, these topic models which don't really necessarily comport to how we think humans behave. So it's not a very good answer, but that's sort of my interpretation of David's question. That's my answer to him.
We're about out of time. So I'd like to thank Arthur Spirling for being our presenter this week. His presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share the presentation or watch it again later. Next week, October 27th at noon Eastern Time, we will host a roundtable on reproducibility and the proposal to impose a stricter threshold for statistical significance. Our panelists will be Dan Benjamin of the University of Southern California, who I believe was one of the lead authors of the paper to which this refers, Daniel Lakens of Eindhoven University of Technology, and E.J. Wagenmakers of the University of Amsterdam. And I don't normally insert myself into these things, but I will also be a panelist because I'm very interested in this question. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Arthur, thanks again for being our presenter this week.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to the audience. I appreciate it.
All right, see everyone next time.
Bye-bye.